Yeah. Yeah, so I think we can jump straight into it. Um, so the topic for today is basically we know we have a racism problem in the Muslim community, and what's the way forward? I'll maybe just start by giving you an overview of the structure. We want to split this into 20-minute slots. So 20 minutes, and then see where, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, will present, and then just and then at the end there'll be a 20-minute Q&A for anyone who wants to ask questions. If you look at the bottom, there should be a Q&A tab, and then I'll just filter the questions from there. So just to introduce our speaker before I introduce the topic, we have a very special guest speaker for today, Eliseo Msomi. I'll just put up her bio over here. Eliseo is a health journalist and activist in South Africa who has dedicated her life to building a more inclusive Islam in her community in East Johannesburg. Her work seeks to celebrate both Islamic and African traditions and ensure that Black Muslims in South Africa are visible and no longer sidelined within the Muslim communities across the country. Both she and her sister attended an Islamic school growing up and were often criticized for incorporating their African cultural background into their religious culture. And since then, she has fought for visibility of Black Muslims in the community. She's a former host of a podcast titled Mercy and Contentment Show, which highlights issues that Black Muslims in South Africa face. In addition to her work as an activist, she is also a journalist holding a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Johannesburg. She currently works as a health journalist for South Africa's Media 24, and in 2019 she contributed to the book If This Be Madness, an anthology to honor the life and courage of Shamima Sheikh, which spotlights Shamima Sheikh, a South African Muslim rights activist. Shukran for so much for being in this way and giving your time. We really appreciate it.
Shukran for having me. I'm so honored. I'm so honored to be recognized by you guys and for you guys asking me to come to speak about such an important topic within our community. Yeah,
Well, so all ours. Yeah.
I've stopped talking about racism for a good 2 years because I was just like, you know, because it became a lot. Personally, it was very triggering at times. It just became a lot, and I think to come back into the sphere and to talk about solutions towards it is something that I think I've been also like looking forward to and thinking about, because it's one thing to always tell your story as a person, but it's also understanding that something must be done, you know. There's a need for change, and possibly because I don't want my nephew and nieces to go through the same things as me, being part of the solution. But for today, I was thinking about maybe like if I could come up with 5 possible solutions that we could use in our Muslim community, because we do know racism exists. And I mean, like if you've read my blog post, which is like almost 5 years old, about my experience as a Black Muslim woman who's Zulu in South Africa, growing up and going to a Muslim school for the 14 years of my life, from nursery right until grade 12. Like my whole schooling career was based in an Islamic atmosphere, but always feeling like I've been left out, you know, always feeling like I don't have a home or space, you know. So, and I think it's a feeling that resonates with many Muslims, Black Muslims in South Africa, you know. So the first thing I wanted to firstly say, like my point of solutions towards eradicating racism in our community, the first point I'd like to make is recognizing racism, recognizing the fact that you are racist as a person. I think it's very important that you recognize and acknowledge that you're a racist. Nobody likes being called a racist. Nobody would admit being a racist, but you can't fight a disease if you don't recognize that you have it. You can't fight the symptoms if you don't recognize that you carry this in your body, you know. And I think it's very important because a lot of times you think because you're a Muslim, you are not racist. And 90% of the time, it's false. You're most likely to be racist. I think it's very important that you acknowledge that you are racist, and secondly, acknowledge your position of power or your position of power in the system that's racist, your position in systematic racism. Where do you fall within that range? You know, we know how things are in South Africa, and I think I'm very honored that it's UCT who's the MSA who has organized this talk, because we know that Cape Town is a very racist place, and people are able to recognize racism very easily in Cape Town. I mean, you just, before you land in Cape Town, you see it at the airport, you see the inequality physically, you feel the experience of racism physically. So it's important that that you firstly recognize racism within yourself and in your family. Because if you don't recognize it within your family also, you are perpetuating it. You are telling them it's okay to behave in a certain way. It's okay for us to carry on treating Black people the way we do. And I think it goes to my second point, or my second point of solutions, is that after you look into yourself and somebody tells you, hey, my guy, I think you're racist. It's not really taking offense, but a moment to reflect on whether you're racist or not and what makes you racist. And one of the solutions towards that, understanding yourself also, and find yourself as your own racism, is actually reading literature on race, engaging even YouTube videos, listening to people's stories about racism, and ask yourself if you've experienced anything similar to that, or if you have, or if you are the person who perpetuates it. So my second point would be, everything in the world, in society, starts from home. And I think a lot of people, especially in the Indian community, your first Black person that you actually interact with is your domestic worker. And how you treat your domestic worker is important, because you are essentially giving dawah to somebody every day by your interactions with her. So if you're racist towards her, you are basically doing Islam an injustice service, right? You're doing disservice to Islam. So I think it's, when you interact with your domestic workers in home, it's recognizing firstly their labor, recognizing that their labor, the work of a domestic worker is very important. And I say this because Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that that half of your deen is in cleanliness. It's like half of your deen is in cleanliness. That's a huge bulk of your iman is in cleanliness. Somebody who is ensuring that half of your iman is being kept intact, and is giving you a space that enables you to connect to Allah every day, and yet you treat them horribly in a racist manner. And it comes back to also this part of self-reflection, of reflecting racism and also understanding it within your own family, within your own community, and calling it out within your family and community. Because we cannot be people who call out Israel and their racism, but be the same people who perpetuate racism within our own communities. In Allah's eyes, an oppressor is an oppressor. Maybe there are degrees of oppression, but you're an oppressor too. And in that way, it's important that you recognize somebody who has elevated your position on earth by making it easier for you to worship Allah. I mean, the role of a domestic worker is very important in spirituality, in connecting you in deen. Because the other benefit is how you are able to also fulfill justice, being a just employer. Because once you exploit a person, you're perpetuating racism, of course. This is all linked to racism. And, our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has a beautiful hadith when he says, you need to pay a worker before their sweat dries. to emphasize that you can't just exploit somebody. You need to ensure that they are well paid, that their labor is recognized. Like our prophet really went in and just like in talking hadiths of how it's not like hadiths were not just on the surface, but they were really societal solutions. And also going back to self, when Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that his main mission was to perfect character. How do we perfect character when we are perpetuators of an oppression, which is racism, right? You can't do that. It's that these are two opposites, because even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that He is on the side of the oppressed. Would you want to be on the side where Allah is not? I think that's one of the things that we need to discuss as Muslims. If you want to eradicate racism and recognize it in your community, you need to first recognize in the community yourself, recognize it in the community, and understand the side of which Allah is on, because Allah is always on the side of the oppressed. And understand if you are perpetuating oppression or you are fighting injustice, as the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ commanded for us, that if you see injustice, fight it with your hands. If you can't fight it with your hands, fight it with your tongue. If you can't fight it with your tongue, make dua. But the weakest amongst you is the one who makes dua. Dua is such an important thing in Islam. It's like how we pray. But it becomes a weakness in terms of fighting injustice. I think Prophet ﷺ really wanted to emphasize the importance of us being just people and perfecting our character, linking that to justice. And it's something that Bell Hooks, who recently passed on, talks about how love and justice are things that you can't have love without justice or justice without love. And I think Prophet Muhammad Islam really does that. Islam is not just a religion, but like it's a life guide on how to be just and promote love and peace, because you cannot have peace without love. So those are my first 2 points. My third point is that being the MSA, which is obviously, in my mind, from my experience, youth-led, the solution is being youth. And I say this because young people are able to bring change. Old people may fight injustice, but young people bring change. We've seen this. June 16, 1976, the turning point in the fight against apartheid. One of the most crucial points in the fight against apartheid. In the 1980s, young people protesting continuously against apartheid. And in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, one of the last things he did before he died was to put Hazrat Osama bin Zaid in power, in a powerful position of making him a leader for an exhibition. And he was very explicit in his instruction, ensuring that he must be the leader. And people were like, but we are older, we have more experience in it. But the Prophet said, I want him. He was just 18. But at that young age, the Prophet was saying that young people who have skills, who are able to be put in leadership positions, young people have power of change. And he was able to conquer in that expedition, and put a territory under Islam. So it shows that even Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had faith in us as young people in bringing about change in Islam, in bringing about change in society, and bringing about peace and understanding. I think for me, that appointment just shows that even Prophet Muhammad ﷺ believes in our capabilities as young people, because a lot of the times people look at prophets getting Nabuwa at 40. And because they get Nabuwa at it's not really an advanced age, because it's between youth and old age. It's such a middle ground age that people think that leadership should be there, and that's why I think we also as society struggle with young leadership. But Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam can put a young person in charge before his death and say that I want him to be appointed and lead Muslims into victory. And he indeed led Muslims into victory. Then we need to understand your power as the MSA, that you're not just an organization to look after Muslim issues on campus, on the campus that you're based or the university you're based in, but to look after societal issues within your community. You know, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did not just serve Muslims, he served the Christians and the Jews, you know, and that is why he even emphasized things like rights to neighbors, rights to friends and family and so forth, because it's understanding that we don't live alone as Muslims. We live in communities of people, different people from us, in our diversity. And even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that what's this verse? I've created you in different nations and tribes so that you may recognize one another. So there is that recognition of one another. And I think recognition in Islam is very layered. It's not just knowing, acknowledging person, but it's respecting people, you know, it's respecting their religion, it's respecting their race and their color. And I think it's also, you even see it in rules of war where Muslims are prohibited from destroying places of worship because there is a respect to other people, to other religions, you know. And in that same space, as young people, it is up to us, I think, to uphold it, because I do understand that a lot of old people will remain racist to their death, and I do understand a lot of people say it's because, you know, apartheid put these segregations, so so it became easier for people to adapt racist tendencies, and I honestly don't believe that, because Islam existed way before apartheid. People came with Islam, you know, came to the borders, came to South Africa with Islam, and Islam has always been anti-racist. So it's either you practice Islam first, or you practice the laws, or you practice oppression laws first. That's a choice that people made. Thirdly, I have like 10 minutes left. No, my fourth point would be choosing the correct role models. This for me is really an important point, because I think for me personally, when it came to how I had to overcome the trauma marks of racism, basically, and how undervaluable it made me feel, and, you know, and a lot of low self-esteem issues that came with it. One of my role models who helped me get out of that was Malcolm X. You know, we just commemorated his death a few days ago, and how he just like instilled the thing of being a Black Muslim and being proud as a Black Muslim, and as a Black Muslim, just understanding yourself, that you are a creation of Allah. Allah has made you beautifully. There's nothing about you as a person that is lacking as a Muslim. So, and I think closer to home for me, 10 out of 10, Imam Harun is one of the greatest role models that we can have in fighting racism in our community, because Imam Harun was recognized that the struggle for freedom cannot just be here within his own community, but it's a struggle for everybody. I think Imam Harun didn't just, you know, fight for his community, because he broke apartheid laws and went into townships in Cape Town and gave dawah, because he recognized that Islam does not belong to his people only, but Islam, it belongs to us all. And that for me is an important aspect of how we should do dawah, because people are still Muslim today because of the way Imam Harun has done dawah. There's a second, third generation Muslims in Langa, Kailisha, Guguletu, and Cape Town because of the way Imam Harun has done dawah. And Imam Harun has done dawah because firstly, it goes back, he chose Allah's laws first over apartheid laws, and in that he understood that his freedom, you cannot get freedom if other people do not have freedom. And it's also understanding Islam as your own freedom as a person, right? Like Islam has liberated us, and you recognize how much Islam has liberated us as people and as a community, that you cannot keep it to yourself. You want it to liberate other people. And Imam Harun really personifies that, in a society that is unequal, in a society that is segregated, he went beyond that and he broke the barriers of segregation, and he said that I'm giving dawah. And alhamdulillah, many Muslims have that, and I thought it was, when I first saw the invitation that it's UCT, I thought, oh my gosh, it's so funny because like Cape Town is the place where Islam first came, and it's also the place where, like, one of the most racist places in the country and one of the most evident. So it's like a paradox of how it's like this topic is there, but it's just like, and Imam Harun was from there, he saw racism at first hand, but he didn't think or see black people as beneath him, but he thought, no, let me go and pass the word of Allah, because, of all the nations and tribes and tribes that Allah has created, of all the nations that Allah has bestowed prophets on, we are the one nation that He has given us the task of prophets, of spreading His deen. So, like, Imam Harun took that and didn't allow apartheid laws, because to also understand yourself as a freedom fighter is understanding that you're not fighting against apartheid for your own race, but rather for everybody in the country. And I think, and my last point, my last solution would be, and this is MSA specific, would be really transforming the JK, the Jamaat Ghana. I think a lot of my friends, myself included, our experiences of the Jamaat Ghana have not been very friendly towards Black people. It's like the moment you enter, like, all eyes on you, like, it feels like you are not in a welcoming space. You feel like you don't even feel like you should be praying, because, like, you're being watched when you're praying as if you're committing a crime. I mean, I had a friend who stopped praying at the JK and started praying at faculty because she couldn't take the stares and the talks and the whispers anymore, because, and she had been on campus for like 3 years for that, so, like, every day was a consistent, it was a consistent battle of trying to find a way to pray without people staring at you, or even, like, my plan was to go after peak time. I used to measure, people normally go like 12:30, 1 o'clock to go pray. I'd delay my salah because I didn't feel like I wanted to ensure that I don't go to the JK at the time where I feel like I'm going to be questioned and asked funny questions and just, but I think it's important that you transform the JK in itself, because we always talk about how the masjid is the center of the community. And I think the JK is the center of the student community. And it's important that transformation happens from there, and how it, and it could be just little things of, like, not just making it like having talks like these ones, firstly, or even, involving Black Muslim students in, maybe say you redecorating the place and how you want to have African touches towards it, just to make it feel more homely towards everybody, So I think it's very important that we transform a very critical space in the Muslim student community, and also I don't know how, but also make it a place of refuge, not just for Muslims, but for everybody. Because if we are going to do dawah on campus, the JK must also be a place of use to other students. They must also seek refuge from there. It shouldn't just be an exclusive place for Muslims. Yeah, yeah, I think my time is up. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I hope I made sense, and may Allah bless this gathering.
Shukran so much, Elizabeth. Very practical advice, but also very heartbreaking at points. We're going to now move on to the discussion section. And this is where I'm going to bring in Asif from MSA Union. Just to frame it first, to understand why we're doing this. For those who've been following our social media, for the last month, we've been looking at Black history in Islam, from key Sahaba, who are often spoken about, to the impact of West and East African scholarship on our intellectual history. But what we really wanted to do was to take this history and then tie it into these conversations, these long overdue conversations of the prevalence of anti-Blackness in our Muslim communities and MSA specifically, and then how that fits into broader structures of white supremacy. So I think last night we posted, I don't know if many of you saw, Sheikh Ahmed Bamba. Sheikh Ahmed Bamba is known for resisting the French colonial struggle and for being a great Sufi saint. He led one of the Sufi orders. But what many people don't know about him was that he also spent a lot of his time resisting and pushing back against the racism within our own Muslim communities and within our own intellectual heritage. Scholars that many times we look up to, but it's something we have to grapple with, that first looking within. So the objective of the UC MSA committee this year, which theme is inclusivity, was to use this discussion beyond the month of February, which is why we're also having it towards the end of the month, to focus on planning in ways that are conducive to practically dismantling the structures of racism and white supremacy that we've internalized, and starting at an organizational level here at the MSA. And we know the MSA Union has recognized and been grappling with this problem for a while now, and I think MSA policy conference 2 years ago, they produced some documents, but Asif might expand on that. So yeah, at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Asif to start the discussion.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق الخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق الهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. Jazakallah khair to Brother Ahmed Gur and the rest of the MSA UCT committee. We are deeply inspired, we are led by your example, and we are deeply grateful for the space that you've opened up in the hope that inshallah this conversation might be a means of planting beneficial seeds, and planting seeds that we hope might lead to meaningful change within our organization, within the Muslim community, and within our society at large, inshallah. So I wanted to actually open up the conversation with the recitation of a few ayat of Quran that I feel personally are very important for us to be grounded in and to help shape and frame the way that we approach the dismantling of, as Ahmed said, racism and white supremacy within our communities. So I was I don't recite as well as Zakari on the website. So I'm going to play the ayah and then I'll read the translation. And I want to explain, just to give some context to this before I go into it. Sister Nadisiwa shared a really important and beautiful verse from the Quran that often gets used in talking about how non-racist Islam actually is. Look at this beautiful ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Oh, you who have believed, we have made you into nations and tribes, so that you may come to know one another." And unfortunately, that ayah often gets decontextualized and in some respects weaponized in terms of Muslim defenses against, accusations of racism. And so I wanted to actually place that ayah in its context within the Quran, within Surah Al-Hujurat, because I believe that there are important ideas that precede that ayah that we need to be reflecting on. So I'm going to play the recitation, inshallah, and then I will read the translation. And if two factions among the believers should fight, then make settlement between the two. But if one of them oppresses the other, then fight against the one that oppresses until it returns to the ordinance of Allah. And if it returns, then make settlement between them in justice and act justly. Indeed, Allah loves those who act justly. The believers are but brothers, so make settlement between your brothers and fear Allah that you may receive mercy. O you who have believed, let not a people ridicule another people. Perhaps they may be better than them. Nor let women ridicule other women. Perhaps they may be better than them. And do not insult one another, and do not call each other by offensive nicknames. Wretched is the name of disobedience after one's faith. And whoever does not repent, then it is those who are wrongdoers.
أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتم واتقوا الله إن الله تواب رحيم.
O you who have believed, avoid much negative assumption. Indeed, some assumption is sin. And do not spy or backbite each other. Would one of you like to eat the flesh of his brother when dead? You would detest it. And fear Allah. Indeed, Allah is accepting of repentance and merciful.
وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير.
O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is knowing and aware. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. I don't have time necessarily to go into a full in-depth, explanation or unpacking of these ayat, but I do hope that they may play an important role in at least framing and giving some kind of context to why it is that we are having the discussion that we are having this evening. To recognize that this is not just a matter of, our dunya, right? Or we're not just fighting racism because these are problems that we are facing in this life, but because, as we have seen, as Nedisiwe has explained, the deep, long-lasting trauma and dehumanization that has been perpetuated for so long has a deep spiritual impact on our hearts and has a deep impact on our akhirah. It's something that we need to be very deeply concerned about as an ethical imperative. And it actually caused me to think about an ayah, a hadith that I really appreciate, and it's something that I would like for us to, inshallah, reflect on. Where Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhum is reported to have said that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam once said, "Help your brother whether he is an oppressor or he is an oppressed one." People asked, "Ya Rasulullah, it is all right to help him if he is oppressed, but how should we help him if he is an oppressor?" Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, "By preventing him from oppressing others." And I'd like for us to take a moment to just sit with that, to reflect on it. How do we internalize and practice on the principle that it is not natural and it is not normal for us to be oppressors towards one another? How do we recognize that for us to be oppressors or to perpetuate oppression is something for which we will be held accountable on the Day of Judgment? So I'd like for us to sit with that for a moment. And inshallah, I'm actually going to flip the script a little bit, because generally what happens in spaces like this is that, the speaker will speak and then they will invite questions and then try to respond to those questions. But in order to ensure that we are getting people engaged in these conversations, in order to ensure that we are actually facilitating some sort of transformation within our organization, within the people, like amongst the people that have chosen to be here, may Allah reward you for being here with us this evening. I'm actually going to pose a few questions that I hope will, at the very least, direct our attention in a meaningful way, in the hope that our energy will follow that attention, right? And so there are a few questions, and I'm going to pose it to the audience, and I'm going to ask that the people that are listening, respond in the comments. Try your best to reflect and to respond. And inshallah, let's see, I don't know if this will work, but bismillah, I'm making dua that it will work. But at least take note of these questions. The first question that I want to pose: how do we account for our knowledge and ignorance of racism, its origins, and its functions? Let me repeat the question. How do we account for our knowledge and ignorance of racism, its origins, and its functions? In other words, to maybe simplify the question, how do we take stock of our understanding of what terms like race, racism, white supremacy, anti-blackness mean? We may have heard these terms being used, maybe in the conversation this evening. You've probably heard these terms being used many times in the course of your life. But I'd like for us to take a moment to reflect on how much do we actually know about what these terms mean. We may make an assumption about our level of understanding, but I'd like for us to actually reflect on, do I know what race means? Do I know what racism actually involves? And I'd like for you to maybe take a moment to share your responses in the question, in the answers, in the comments. How do we actually measure our level of understanding? And let's take a moment to reflect on that, and then let's share our responses. Bismillah. So Nawab has said, firstly, by holding open discussions to understand the wide scope of its effects, hold surveys, create holistic spots of support and teaching. MashaAllah. Any other ideas? So just to repeat the question, how do we measure our understanding of what race, racism, anti-blackness mean? Please feel free to share your responses in the comments. And I think it's important for us to, as we are reflecting on this, to reflect on our sources of knowledge, right? how many of us can actually distinctly recall any conversations being had going through madrasa, going through school? Some of us may have gone to Muslim schools. How many of us can actually distinctly remember any conversations being had around racism, despite the fact that we live in such a racist, unequal society? The likelihood is that many of us probably, despite going through a whole, Islamic system, however, whatever your level of learning might have been, there's a high likelihood that we never really get any exposure to these conversations, right? So let's take a moment. Zainab says, it begins with a self-introspection of your own understanding of race and your own personal integration with people of other races. Integration and interaction with people of other races. Shakil says, Ikra, read. Read the room. Read the books about this. Read the Quran. Read think pieces by victims of racism. I'm going to keep this question open for a minute or two more. So just to remind us, again, the question is, how do we measure our understanding of what race, racism, and these terms that shape our understanding actually mean? Amara Garda, our head of politics and international relations, says, for me, it's important to make sure that my understanding and views on racism match as closely as possible to the lived experiences of those who bear the brunt of racism. And that's a very important point. Very meaningful question that Zainab has asked here. Do you consider all people as fully human as yourself? SubhanAllah. So please feel free to continue sharing your responses to this question in the comments. But I'm now going to move on to the second question that I would like for us to reflect on. How would you describe, or how would we describe rather, for lack of a better word, an anti-racist future? In other words, if you are joining us this evening, then we will take that as an indication that A, you recognize that there is a problem, and B, you know that this problem needs to be addressed if we are to realize a better world, right? And so the question that then emerges from that is, what will that better world look like? So I'd like for us to take a moment to think about, what might an anti-racist future look like? What is the kind of world that we are aiming towards creating? What are we trying to do by having conversations like this, by engaging in this kind of discussion? What sort of world are we trying to build? So let's take a moment to think about what is the future that we are trying to work towards? What are what is the world that we envision for ourselves? And I think Sister Nelly Siwe alluded to this, right? By saying that she doesn't want her nieces and nephews to go through the things that she went through, right? And so necessarily it begs the question of, what do we have to do, or rather, what kind of world are we trying to aim towards, or what kind of world are we trying to build so that they won't have to go through those sorts of things? So being aware of the privileges we may hold or benefit from, and how having those privileges may affect those who do not look like ourselves. Very important point. So just to reiterate, the next question that we are focusing on now is a question of, what is the world that we are aiming towards? What sort of future are we trying to build? Shahada. A future where everyone's worth is not based on our race and racial stereotypes. Equality for all races. MashaAllah. MSA UWC. A future where people are both Allah conscious and have good adab that would inspire those around you. For example, show your love to Allah, and through Allah, and people may follow. Amara. a world where the scenario you mentioned from the Hadith, being able to prevent oppressors from oppressing people, that is why anti-racism work is pivotal. Nasiba, an equal world, free of judgmental ways and behavior, and acknowledging people's feelings and excluding race from the equation. Interesting. When we add wisdom, oh, sorry, Ma, I lost the question here. When we add wisdom to knowledge to get to understand the message of the Quran better. Interesting. Zahara, an anti-racist future acknowledges inclusion in all spaces. It recognizes everyone as human, and we get to exist as that. Subhanallah. Zainab, a future where all are recognized in their full humanity. Subhanallah. So let's take a couple more minutes. I just want to give more people an opportunity to maybe share their reflections. So just to reiterate, the question that people have been responding to and offering some really beautiful responses is, what sort of future are we working towards? What might an anti-racist future look like? And so, yeah, this has been the framing question, and I'm going to allow a little bit more time for us to really reflect on it. Think about the future that you want to leave behind for your children, right? Or for the children in your family, right? So maybe you've got cousins who've got children, or maybe you've got nieces and nephews of your own. And in 20 years' time, they're going to be like our age, right? And so let's take a moment to think about, okay, what sort of world do we want to leave behind for them at least? All right, or what sort of world are we trying to create for them? And really, let's try to unpack that a little bit more. So I'll give everyone a couple more minutes, and then we'll move on to the next question, inshallah. So while people are still typing up their responses, the last question that I kind of want to, work from, right, is that now that we've given some thought to the sort of futures that we want to build and the sort of futures that we are aiming towards, the next question that I want us to really think about and to reflect on is, what are the most significant obstacles that we face on a personal level, on an organizational level, and on an institutional level that are currently obstructing us from realizing the futures that we want to see? So again, what are the most significant obstacles that we face, perhaps on a personal level, on an organizational level, or on an institutional level, that are currently obstructing us from realizing the futures that we want to see? Once again, I'd like to see, some responses from the audience. Let's get some ideas. What are the obstacles that we are facing currently that you feel are affecting us, either personally, in our own communities, in our families, whatnot? It would probably take a shift of faith for people to let go of their racist ideologies. Although idealistic, it would only be possible with deep faith in Allah and equality of human beings. MashaAllah. So just to repeat the question, what are the most significant obstacles that we face currently on a personal level, on an institutional level, maybe on an organizational level, that are currently obstructing us from realizing the futures that we want to see? Zahara says, lack of diversity in spaces that require them. Okay. Also removing structural racism and societal racism. How we are taught to compete as races in sports, education, and everything around us. Zainab says, recognizing our conscious and unconscious biases, and that as Muslims is what this deen is meant to cure, to purify and cleanse our hearts. MashaAllah. My mom says there is still an us and them mentality. I agree, Mom. Another huge problem, the comfort, what comes with privilege, makes a lot of people inactive. I definitely agree, Sarah. Of social awareness and the impact of our own prejudices. MashaAllah. Yusra says, on a personal level, I think the fact that we're so divided as Muslims in terms of culture makes it difficult to imagine an anti-racist future. I appreciate your honesty, Yusra. Amara says, a defensive response to being called out on racism instead of introspection. SubhanAllah. Nasiba. Racism in the Indian community is not acknowledged on grassroots levels, at home, at family functions. That needs to be directly faced. So just to reiterate for those who joined a little bit later, the question that people are responding to at the moment is, what are the most significant obstacles that we face on a personal, organizational, and institutional level that are currently obstructing us from realizing the futures that we want to see? And we've received some really, really amazing responses so far. And so obviously, because my time is limited and I don't want to go over the time that has been prescribed for me, I'd now like to close with a reflection from your end. Unfortunately, actually, you know what? Before we go into the reflection, I think we may let's Ahmed, you may need to guide me on this. But if we have time, can we maybe open up the floor to questions that other people might have? Because I've been asking the questions so far, and I think I'm going to rob people of that opportunity as well.
Yeah, so we do have actually quite a few questions that have come through. I'm not so sure if Instagram Live cuts off at an hour. So if it does cut off, then we'll just start a new session, and I have the questions saved.
Okay.
Is Nelly still there? There's quite a few questions for her specifically.
I'm still here.
All right. So I'll just put the questions on the screen. I think you'll probably be able to see them. So I'm just going to go in order. First with Amara's question. I'll read it out in case it doesn't appear. Assalamu alaikum. How can non-Black Muslims be activists for anti-racism and allies of Black Muslims without speaking on behalf of Black Muslims?
I think activism is just about being an activist, and just being in the spaces that you are in, and you recognize that this is a racist act. You need to stop it. I don't think it's anything deep. I think it's just, being an activist fully in acknowledging acknowledging racism, acknowledging the structures of racism, and being part of the solution towards breaking those structures. I think that's the best way to be a anti-racist activist without speaking for people who are oppressed.
And the second question I put up now is racism the reason why the growth of the Muslim population in this country is so stagnant?
100% yes. It's a reason why we've also seen a lot of Black Muslims leave Islam also. Because you come into Deen, you are excited, you want to learn about Deen, and the spaces where knowledge is unfortunately in, you are unwelcomed, you are looked at funny, you experience racism, and then you start to question that if Islam has been with these people for so many decades and centuries, and makes them racist and doesn't really, and hasn't really changed who they are, how is it going to change me as a person? But it's also because of the trauma that it has inflicted a lot of people. Some people that I went to school with who are Muslim, His mothers became Muslim while they were kids, and obviously because their mother became Muslim, the mother sent them to Muslim school, so the whole family became Muslim. And because of the trauma that they experienced there, they are not Muslim anymore because of the bad treatment. So it's 100% the reason why Islam is not growing in the country. It's 100% why people don't see Islam as a solution towards our problems as society.
And this is a question from Zafra that maybe Asif can answer. I'm a student, I'm curious to know whether the MSA itself has drafted a policy on anti-Blackness.
So this is something that, as Ahmed mentioned, a couple of years ago, the MSA went through a process of policy development. In 2019, March of 2019, we hosted a policy conference at which Dedisiwe was present as well. That was intended to draft policies that were intended to guide MSA chapters across the country in terms of how do we address problems that we are facing as an organization on a systemic level, across the board and on the national level. One of the policies that we did focus on was that of transformation. And based on recognizing the need for transformation within the MSA, which has been and historically exclusive space towards Black Muslims, towards Muslim women, especially in terms of Black Muslims being in positions of decision-making power and in executive positions within the MSA. So the policy has been drafted, right? But, unfortunately, especially with COVID and the obstacles that placed in our path, the limitations, part of the limitations were that it hindered our capacity to work towards the kind of training that was needed in order to ensure that the policies were implemented. That being said, obviously we have to take full responsibility for that shortcoming, and my capacity as the head of Tarbiyah and training, I will take full responsibility for that shortcoming, because that was an intention. It wasn't obviously, in order to ensure that the policies get implemented, necessarily you have to work with chapters, alongside chapters, in order to ensure that we are going through this kind of facilitation process, where we're understanding why these policies are needed, where we have some kind of idea of the context in which we are operating, and the role that, as Nedisiwe pointed out, that we as the Muslim Students Association can play in affecting the kind of broader social change that's needed within our communities. And so that being said, there's obviously still work to be done on that policy, right? It's obviously not a perfect document. I think that there are aspects that may need to be revised. But our hope is that we can still be here to support as new generations of MSA leaders come into the fold, to guide students through this process with reference to those policies, to say that, listen, we are committed and we must remain committed to, as we mentioned, realizing the futures that we want to see. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question, Zahar. And inshallah, we make dua that Allah allows us to refine those policies and make them even more effective and impactful, inshallah.
And there's a question from Shakil. How does racism perpetuate when people are of different races but of same class or income level?
I think even Black people who are in affluent areas or who have income and wealth and access to certain powers will tell you that the treatment of being seen as inferior is still the same. As much as racism is linked to classism, but as long as there's a systematic racism, we will always see people, even like a patriotism, people will probably tell you how racist white men are, who probably have less wealth than him, because it's really going back to the root of racism, where racism comes from. When Shaitan rejected Prophet Adam, it was a thing of superiority. He wanted to show that Adam can't be greater than me. because he's made of clay, I'm made of smokeless fire, you know. So that pride, the thing of looking down on people that comes with being racist is still there, you know. So money doesn't make people less victims of of racism.
And then we have another question from Shakil. Does intermarriage promote social cohesion between different races and groups?
No, 100% no. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with the notion that marriage is the answer in us stopping people from being racist. People have ended up marrying racists. They're discovering within their marriage that they have married a racist human being. I don't think love between two people should be based on race. I think if people love each other and they want to get married to each other, it shouldn't, like, race shouldn't be the basis of why they're getting married. And it's people getting married from outside the race shouldn't be a solution at all. It's really not a solution.
Right. And just as a note, we'd like to keep it as an open, safe space. So if anyone wants the question to be anonymous, you can just put that in the question in brackets, and I won't share it on the screen. I'll just ask it. Then there's, I think this is a follow-up question or comment from Zahara, and beyond to ask if ensures and regulates that non-Black members and leaders aren't racist.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I caught the question.
So I think this is asking a question that does the policy that was drafted in any way ensure that and regulate that non-Black members and leaders aren't racist?
So I'm going to be honest with you, right, and with the audience, right? As somebody in the comments has said, policy is nothing without implementation. Okay, and so it's a question that I think we do need to grapple with from an organizational level, and I think on MSA, like in terms of MSA Union, right, in terms of, you know, how much teeth does the policy have, and to what extent can the policy actually effectively root out racism within the organization. And I think that you know, there's on some level there's a bit of a balance, right, that is struck between what the policy says, and in the policy, yes, there are disciplinary measures that are specified, that are highlighted to say that, you know, if members are found to be I don't want to misquote the policy, right? So if we do need to have a relook at the policy, I will share that with you, inshallah, and we can maybe take that conversation a little bit further. But I don't want to misrepresent what's in the policy document. But effectively, there are disciplinary measures that are incorporated within the policy. But if members and if the chapters are not made aware of these policies, and if the policies are not used as a basis for, you know, further training, you know, that becomes something that, you know, again, we have to take full responsibility for. And so, you know, I think that the long-term, obviously, again, like the long-term aim that we are trying to inculcate and the culture that we are trying to nurture and develop, especially through conversations like this, is to say that we don't want it to get to a point where, you know, the disciplinary measures are even needed, right? We want to put proactive measures in place to ensure that we, you know, affect that change from a grassroots level, from a way that is going to really, you know, shift the culture of the organization. That being said, the disciplinary measures are needed. And so, yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question again, Zahara. And I think I do recognize and acknowledge the question from Shahada. I think racism is a cancer. What are the structures that you have in the MSA that can recognize racist people and make sure that they do not get power? Because policy is nothing without implementation. And again, I think that in the spirit of honesty, in the spirit of vulnerability, I can say that, you know, we do have in terms of our constitutions, in terms of the policy documents, there are, disciplinary measures and reporting mechanisms that have been put in place to say that, if you experience racism as a Black Muslim student, it's like, again, the responsibility falls on the executive to address that issue and to ensure that, if the exec can't address it, then it needs to be escalated to the level of the national structure at least, right? And MSA Union, as the executive body, as the national structure, has the authority and has the jurisdiction to affect that disciplinary measure within our chapters, right? And so, that's part of the intention as to why the national body was created, and why this national structure was created, was to ensure that we can actually affect the kind of change that might be needed on a grassroots level. But again, it's not intended to be a kind of top-down process. It's something that we need to be working alongside our chapters. It's something that we need to be working together with the leaders that are in our ranks to ensure that we actually affect this change, where we can.
All right. Then we just have one final question, and perhaps we can use this to just initiate the concluding thoughts, because it's very similar to what we've been talking about this whole time. And that's the question from Shakil, is how to eradicate racism in order to transform Muslim organizations. Perhaps both of you can answer this and use it as an opportunity to give you concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I think the basis of everything always starts with policy, when we come together and we put our thoughts together and say, that these are the laws and the regulations that we want to follow, just like the Quran is a guiding book for us. Organizations need to also take a stance on that, like on having anti-racist policies and implementing them effectively, even to a point of maybe even appointing an anti-racist officer to ensure that the organization has standards where the racial intolerance is not where racial intolerance is a priority in almost every sphere of the organization. To also look at other parts of the organization. For example, charity. How do we give charity as an organization? Are we protecting the dignity of the people that we're giving charity to? Are we ensuring that their faces are not being exposed? Are we maintaining their rights as human? Their right to dignity as the Constitution underlines. But also, how are we doing this charity in a sense that makes Muslims look good in society? Not as a PR exercise, but where people can sincerely feel the impact of Muslims in society, where they can feel that Muslims are doing good work and they want to be part of that. Where even like an organization like the MSA, although it has Muslim inside, other people want to join the MSA, and they may not be Muslims, but they want to be part of the work that the MSA does. And I think a good example of that is the Gift of the Givers. Of the work, it does impactful work within the community. It does not just serve Muslims, but serves the general public. And because of that, people want to donate to it. People want to be part of the work that they do because it's a societal thing. They come up with societal solutions. And that's the importance of Muslim organizations, that we have Islam, we have the Quran, we have all of these things that have empowered us. And it's using yourself as an organization to bring about change within the communities that we are in, so that the communities that we are in are able to see the beauty of Islam, which also speaks to which will also take care of things that we are talking about, the stagnancy of growth of Muslims in the country. Things like this help with the growth of Islam. People's perception of Islam changes, and people start seeing the Ubuntu-ness of Islam. So I think it really starts from writing this down and manifesting the writing into into reality and becomes something that has results that are tangible in society.
Yeah, I think if I can maybe build on what Nedisiwe is saying, there's a very basic principle that I think is something that we can maybe stay grounded in, and that is that energy follows attention. Right? Energy follows attention. So where we pay energy and how we pay attention, so where we pay attention and how we pay attention will play a critical role in shaping where energy is directed and how that energy is directed, right? And so if we are serious and if we are sincere about working to eradicate racism in order to transform Muslim organizations, we need to draw attention to the fact that, yes, we are racist, right? And we've internalized deeply, we've internalized anti-Blackness as a consequence of, these long legacies of colonialism and apartheid, as a consequence of the structures of white supremacy, and the role that they've played in conditioning these ways of being, these ways of knowing, these ways of thinking, as a consequence of, as Ahmed was alluding to, the erasure of Black African knowledge systems and experiences and histories. That there's no escaping from that, right? Like, Muslim organizations do not exist in isolation from these societies that have been structured along these lines, right? And so if we are, like I said, if we are sincere in wanting to eradicate racism from our communities, then we have to make a concerted effort to draw attention to those histories, right? To unpack and make sense of the role that these histories have played in shaping and conditioning our ways of knowing, right? And our theologies, our ways of thinking about what it means to be Muslim in light of this context, right? It means, focusing on issues like land, right? And drawing attention to, the disparity in ownership of land, and that as one of the most significant legacies of colonialism and apartheid, right? To look at the role that land has played in engendering the kind of forced displacements that have affected so many of our communities, right? And to see this all as being related, right? And to see that it's all not, these issues don't exist in isolation from one another, but we are all deeply entangled in these structures and in these knowledge systems. And I think that it's a lot, and I don't know if you're being honest, will we witness the eradication of racism in our lifetimes? Realistically speaking, I'm not sure that we will. Right, and I'm not saying that to be pessimistic, or I'm not saying that to downplay, what the conversation that we were having today is. But I'm not sure that the eradication of racism is what Allah is asking of us, right? My understanding, and this is again, like, I'm willing to be challenged on this. My understanding is that when on the Day of Judgment, when we stand before Allah, Allah will ask us, "What did you do when you saw the oppression that was going on in your society? Did you do the best that you could with the resources that you had, with the relationships that you had, with the time that you had, with the learning that you had, with the knowledge that I blessed you with, to do whatever you could in your capacity, to affect a change where you could?" Because Allah's not going to ask you, "Did you solve racism? Did you solve the problem that it was created over hundreds of years and like across every societal and social and political level, and it was entrenched and embedded in almost every conceivable aspect of your being?" Or is Allah going to say, "What did you do?" Right? What did you do with the time that you had? And so I think that it's important for us to maybe think, like, I suppose, reframe our understanding. Not for the sake of saying, obviously, yes, if we want to see a world that's free of racism. We want to see a world in which racism is eradicated. But in order to not become despondent, in order to not lose hope, we also need to recognize our limitations, right? And we need to recognize that all change ultimately comes from Allah, and we are the vessels through which that change happens, right? And so it's only by the grace of Allah, by the permission of Allah, that we can affect the change that we want to see. But again, it needs to start within ourselves. It needs to start with, what am I doing in my own capacity first? On a personal level, how am I then changing the organizations of which I am a part? Then those organizations form part of bigger institutions, right? So, it's not unfeasible, right? But it's something that we need to take one step at a time. And inshallah, by the permission of Allah, we will realize that reality. And if not in our lifetimes, then at least for future generations. But our role is to plant the seeds. And yeah, that's my final take on it.
All right. Thank you very much. I think we can end it off there on that powerful note. A big thank you to Nelisiwe, to Asif, for coming and giving us your time to be here. It was, I think, a very fruitful discussion. I learned a lot personally. And also a thank you to the Current Affairs portfolio at MSA UCT for organizing this whole thing and putting it together. I really hope there's not a once-off thing that we do every February because it's Black History Month and then we're tied into racism, but something that we can actually act on. And I really appreciate that the advice today was very practical. Something we can really push through going forward, March, April, going on. Shukran again for coming. I will save the live, inshallah, and then anyone can watch it afterwards. All right. Salams, everyone.
May Allah accept it, and may Allah place barakah in everything that we do, inshallah. And may we see an anti-racist future in our lifetime, inshallah.